Hello, I am Emily Johnson and I am a food historian, and I want to tell you a little bit about the three sisters that Native Americans valued so much as food resources. I am part Cherokee, and the Cherokee were one of the tribes that heavily relied on these resources. Even before contact with Europeans, they practiced agriculture, and that was a big part of their diet. The three sisters are another name for, I have visual aids, corn, beans, and squash. Oh, squash is apparently the same color as my green screen. That was interesting. So corn, beans, and squash are a wonderful trio, and they belong together, and they're called the three sisters because when you grow them together, they have kind of an almost symbiotic relationship. Corn is incredibly productive per acre and per amount of work. So corn gives you a lot of return on your effort, and it is very nutritious, and it provides protein as well as calories, but corn is not a complete protein. If you are a vegetarian, you've probably read about complete proteins and how important it is to get all the amino acids that you need. If you don't get complete proteins, you can develop vitamin deficiencies and protein deficiencies like pellagra or beriberi or other things. They can be fatal. So to make corn a complete protein, you need to eat it with beans. You can eat it with other things like rice, but corn and beans together make a complete protein. So even if you're not getting any meat at all, eating just corn and beans, you will fill all your protein needs. And okay, squash is not a good source of protein. So why is it important? Why is it part of the trio? Well, all three of these foods soar very well over the winter, and you can keep them for months, especially depending on what kind of squash. This is zucchini. Zucchini is not going to keep for months, but other kinds of squash like pumpkins or Hubbard squash will keep for months and months. Now, if you plant corn, beans, and squash together, they do even better. It's even more productive. Corn is not able to reproduce without human help. It is so dependent on human beings to survive that we have to plant it. If corn, just like an ear of corn, fell to the ground, it would probably not be successful in growing. It would have to, all the individual little seeds, each one of these things is an individual seed. They would have to fight their way through the husk of the corn to get out, to sprout. Even if they managed to do that, you'd have dozens or even hundreds of seeds right there competing with each other for nutrients and light, and they would strangle each other and not be successful. Corn has become, through centuries of selective breeding by humans, corn has become dependent on humans to reproduce. So when you first plant corn, it is not very good at fighting off weeds. That is one reason that today farmers put tons of herbicides on their cornfields. And there are even special breeds of corn made by Monsanto that are resistant to herbicides. Herbicides kill weeds, but they can also kill other plants. So by genetically engineering corn strains that are resistant to herbicides, you can plant the corn, douse your field with tons of herbicides, kill all the weeds, and your corn won't have any competition. I'm sure you can see why this is not great for the environment or the people who work with the herbicides. But what southeastern American Indians used to use instead was they would plant corn, beans, and squash together. Squash, if you've ever grown zucchini or pumpkins or something like that in your garden, you know it grows wild, it grows like crazy. You can get a ton of vines and a ton of squash very quickly. And it has those nice big leaves that shade the ground. By shading the ground, the squash plants help keep down weeds, which benefits the corn. The corn doesn't have to compete with the weeds. Once the corn gets bigger and taller, it has those nice tall stalks, as you can see in my little faux background behind me. You all know what corn looks like when it's growing, I'm sure. Well, those stalks are excellent for the beans, because if you've ever grown beans or even peas or sweet pea flowers, you know they need something to twine up. Nowadays, people have to stake their beans or things like that. Well, if you plant your beans intermingled with corn, they just use the corn stalks as their stakes and grow right up the stalk of corn. And this benefits the beans, it benefits the farmer. All three of these plants grow really well together. And this is one reason that they are the three sisters. There's another reason that modern science has totally confirmed how smart the Native Americans were to do this. And corn, like all cereal grains, strips the soil of nutrients. It depletes the soil of nitrogen. If you go to the store and you buy a bag of fertilizer and it has like 3 numbers, like 15, 10, 10, the first number is nitrogen. And you could not, in earlier times, you could not just run down to the store and get a bag of fertilizer. And yes, they did use some animal and human waste as fertilizer, but they didn't keep nearly enough domestic animals to fertilize all of their fields. And so after several years of growing corn in the same field, the soil would be depleted of nitrogen and the corn would start to be less productive because it wasn't getting the nutrients it needed from the soil. And one solution to this is beans. Yes. Beans actually restore nitrogen to the soil. They're replenishing the nitrogen in the soil. It's not the beans themselves, it's bacteria that grow on the roots of the beans in little nodules, and they actually take the nitrogen around them. Nitrogen is a very common element. It's the most common element in the atmosphere, but they convert the nitrogen into a form that the plants can use. So by planting beans with corn, the beans are keeping the soil replenished and providing nitrogen for the corn, so you can continue planting the same thing in the same place for decades without a loss of crop yield. And this is brilliant, and I'm sure that the Native Americans in the 15th century or whatever did not know about nitrogen fixing bacteria, but they did know that when they planted beans and corn together, they got better yields, and they weren't stupid, so they took advantage of that. People in the past were not stupid. They were just like people today. They just had different knowledge. And if they could find a way to make their lives easier, they were totally going to do it. So not only are corn, beans, and squash a wonderful combination for humans to eat, they're a wonderful combination to farm together. We don't really do this anymore. You can see in this picture behind me, we have a monoculture of corn, nothing but corn for the whole field. That's very efficient if you want to mechanically harvest your crops. It'd be really hard to devise a machine that could harvest corn, beans, and squash all mixed together in the same field. That just wouldn't work. But when you have a monoculture where you have nothing but one crop in a whole field, it makes it much more common for you to have diseases. And it also depletes the soil faster, which if you're going to buy artificial fertilizer, you could cope with that. But if you're not able to buy artificial fertilizer, you are going to want to do intercropping where you mix the crops together. And this combination of the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash, was a brilliant, brilliant way to get the most out of the land without harming the land. And it provided the nutrients that people needed to survive. Even if you weren't very successful hunting, you would not have protein deficiencies. You would not have these nutrient deficiencies if you ate corn, beans, and squash together. You don't even have to eat them all at the same meal. You could eat corn today and beans tomorrow. I should probably say this is not nutritional advice. I'm not recommending that you eat nothing but corn, beans, and squash. I am not a medical doctor, but I am a food historian, and I hope you enjoyed this little tiny taste of food history. Thank you.